Okay, this is the last one. I don't know how long I'm going to spend on this one, but one thing about this week of classes is that there's a lot of stuff here to challenge your sense of cultural relativism or relativity. Both are used. So we just finished talking about female genital cutting. Now we're moving into cannibalism. And I have to tell you, when I was trying to decide if I wanted to be an anthropologist, I went to the American Anthropological Association conference. This was back in 1992, and it was in San Francisco. And I got to see Beth Conklin present on some of her research back then. And she was fascinating, and I really liked it. And so I really am interested in this stuff. Anyway, she is doing research among a group of people in Brazil who call themselves the Paca Nova, but they're also known as the Wari. And they practice mortuary cannibalism, which is essentially eating your own dead. And that sounds a little weird, but we usually, when we think of cannibalism, it's like, people eating their enemies. This is the way that bodies were traditionally disposed of. And if I were there in person, I would say, how do we dispose of bodies in our culture? And you would say things like, oh, burial, and I'd say, yeah, and then cremation, and right. But there are different ideas about that are connected to religion. So, for instance, the Abrahamic religions are much more likely to have burial as the main means of putting dead bodies out of sight, because they believe in, a judgment day and the idea that the dead are going to resurrect. And so you need to have that body. In a lot of Christian cemeteries, the cemetery itself is sacred ground. And in the past, centuries ago, if somebody committed sins, they wouldn't be able to be buried in sacred ground. And that was considered a real problem. On the other hand, in the Eastern religions, you're going to see people believing in reincarnation. And there's not this idea that this body is going to rise from the dead. The body doesn't matter. You're done with it. And so what happens there is cremation, where the bodies are broken down and destroyed, and there's no need to save the body. And so when we look at how a society disposes of its dead, we have to kind of think about their ideas about the afterlife and whether that body is going to be important. And here, it is important, because it's how you treat the dead body that allows the person to go on to the afterlife. So let's explore this a bit more. Endo versus exo. Here are some nice prefixes for you. Inside is endo, exo is outside. And so, for instance, you have an endoskeleton. Congratulations. A bee, or a beetle, or a roach has an exoskeleton. So your skeleton is inside your body. Their skeleton is, that hard carapace on the outside. Anthropologists love to talk about endogamy versus exogamy. Endogamy is marrying within your group. If I'm Amish, I'm going to marry somebody Amish. Exogamy is marrying outside your group or outside your clan. And sometimes that's very important, because you don't want to have the genes mixed with each other too much. Endocannibalism is eating people in your group. Exocannibalism is eating people who are not in your group. So you've got it. The Wari do both, or at least they did. They don't practice cannibalism of any kind anymore. But they did eat their enemies occasionally, and when they did, it was this very rough, eating flesh off the bone, vengeful kind of eating. But endocannibalism, eating your own dead, was very much more formal, very much more ritualized, and very much more respectful. All right, so why do you want to eat your own dead? Well, they're not really thoughtful about it. It's tradition, right? It's the custom. Why do we eat our dead? Because that's what I was taught to do. And by the way, Beth Conklin was asking older people in the community about their practices. And so they're remembering this when this still went on. Another thing is you're not missing the dead as much. And part of that is a lot of societies, well, I'll talk about that in a second, but reminders of the dead make you miss them more, so you try to forget them. And then one that's extremely important is how disrespectful it is if you were to let a body decompose. Now, we don't think about that too much in our society, but there, it's just the worst thing that could happen is for your body to decay and decompose. And if you're in the middle of an Amazon jungle, that's going to be a fast process, and a smelly process and a horrifying process. And to let that happen to somebody is just not permissible. So how do you comfort those left behind? Well, you eat the dead because you don't want to be reminded of the dead. So there are other things that are involved here. They have not super permanent structures, so you get rid of, let's say Bob died, Bob's house, and you're going to get rid of Bob's possessions. You stop using the person's name. Now, this is kind of an interesting one. Let's say that Bob died, and then, there's little Bob who's across the way. You don't call Bob Bob anymore. You might call him, the guy with the great muscles who died. That was weird. Sorry about that. But you'd have to change anybody else's name who was Bob as well. So it'd be like, okay, you're Larry now. And then finally you consume the body of the loved one. And this is about grieving. All right, so funerals. Kinship is really important in Wari society. You have two types of kin. You have the Irinari, which is the blood kin, people you're genetically related to. Your spouse gets to go into this category, even though you're probably not genetically related to your spouse. And then the Nari Paksi. And the Nari Paksi are the in-laws. So you get married, and this is your husband's parents or your wife's brother and sister, and they are the ones whose responsibility it is to consume the dead. So you would never eat your own child, your own husband, your own parents. Instead, you would eat your father-in-law. You would eat your brother-in-law. And so it's a big responsibility. Now, the food preparation is done by the affines. Affine is a word that anthropologists use to describe kin who have married into a family. And so the in-laws are the ones preparing the dead. Everybody's sitting around crying, being very upset. And one thing that's different is in our culture, we don't touch corpses very much. We used to. It used to be the case that if somebody in your family died, you were responsible for washing and preparing the body for burial in American culture. But we're not prone to touch the dead anymore. Among the Wari, you touch them like crazy. You do not let them get away from you. You are in constant physical contact with them. In fact, Beth Conklin describes an activity where people will lie on top of the corpse, and then somebody will lie on top of that person, and somebody will lie on top of that person. And eventually the person next to the corpse, on top of the corpse in this stack, is going to have so many people on top of him or her that they'll pass out from lack of oxygen. And when that person passes out, you pull them off, and the next person gets piled on. And this is a symbolic co-dying. This is a way to die along with the person who has died. And so it's very empathetic. In the past, the corpse was roasted on a roasting rack. Beth Conklin has some pretty cool pictures drawn by some of the folks who remember this, although they're done like in Crayola pen. So in a way, they remind me of kids' drawings, but like really awful ones that would get you sent to the principal's office, like an arm on a grill kind of thing. The body would be taken apart. Not all parts were edible, so you would burn those. And it was terribly sad to prepare the corpse, to take it away from its relatives who are in contact with it, remember. There's a lot of crying, ugly crying, and then you have this transformation of the corpse, and that should trigger you to think about rites of passage. The corpse is changing from one thing into another. Who eats the corpse? We talked about this. Oh, I did do one of these pictures. See? Isn't that? I don't know if I can get it to focus. Anyway, that's kind of creepy. She said judgmentally with ethnocentrism, but I mean seriously. When that goes up online, you'll see a better image of it. So you only eat the people that are your in-laws. You're trying to eat everything, but people get sick. People are sad. This is not enjoyable revenge eating. This is people crying while they're eating. It's yucky. And you're eating somebody you love. But you're preventing them from decomposing, which is good. And it's a service, because when you do this, you're ensuring that they get the right afterlife. It's interesting because you don't want the body to be contaminated by dirt. And this is in contrast with a very old religion, Zoroastrianism, where you wouldn't want the dirt to be contaminated by the body. The Zoroastrians traditionally, and they still do this, put the bodies in what they call sky towers, and they're up in the sky, away from people, way over your head, and they are consumed by birds primarily, some insects, and then once they're clean bones, you can bring them down again and bury them. But you would not want to contaminate the soil with a decaying body. That's the Zoroastrians, this word. But the Wari, it's the reverse. The body itself would be contaminated by contact with yucky dirt. And so you don't want that to happen, which is another reason you eat them. And so cannibalism protects the body from contact with the dirt, protects the body from decay, and the body continues to live, right? It's part of people now. What's interesting is this ties in with the afterlife. The Jami Karawa, the Wari believe that all the animals in the rainforest have spirits, and that these spirits, when they die, become human. And their afterlife, it takes place underwater. And when you, kill a jaguar, for instance, its spirit will go to this underwater place and it will be human. When a person dies, you have to eat them so that their spirit will go to this underwater afterlife. And it's a very nice afterlife. It's very much like life that you would have before you died. You get together with people, you have more kids, you have a job, I guess. You do things anyway, probably not a job. But there's this continued contact. And every once in a while, the spirits that used to be human will repay the living humans by coming up out of the water and taking over a herd of a type of pig-like animal. I can think of now as the Spanish name of it, the javelinas, but they're also known as peccaries. And these peccaries will run around in groups. And when a group of peccaries, and I've got them on the next page, there's some kids with a peccary. The peccary doesn't have a long nose, that's the table. So that's there. The peccaries travel in groups, and they are understood as being animated by the spirits of the dead who are bringing you meat as a reward for being so awesome to have eaten them. So you eat Bob, then Bob goes to this wonderful afterlife, and every once in a while Bob will repay you by possessing an animal and making it run near the village where you can shoot it and eat it. But the interesting part is that the peccaries have the spirits of the dead in them while they're being cooked. Excuse me. And shamans can actually speak to the dead spirit of the person while they're in the peccary. So at that conference I went to, Beth Conklin described having a situation where she was watching a shaman having an animated conversation with a peccary that was being roasted, and then the shaman explained to another man, hey, this is your wife, she's doing great, she's remarried, she has a couple more kids, and it's a way for the dead to revisit the living. I mean, we've got Halloween coming up, and you may be familiar with the Day of the Dead, El Dia de los Muertos. I guess you can have Las Muertas too. But this is another way that the dead return. And so it ties in with the endocannibalism because you eat the dead over and over and over. What's interesting is that this practice was outlawed by the Brazilian government. And so now, in a move that kind of astounds me, the Wari bury their dead, which is totally the opposite of what they used to do. And I think that's the last slide on there. All right. I hope to see you Wednesday. Bye.